Before Mass begins, the server must dress the altar in preparation. He first removes the cover from the altar. He places the altar cards in their proper positions, the center card in the center, the lavabo card on the epistle side, and the last gospel card on the gospel side. He lights the candles, which at low Mass are only 2. First the epistle side, then the gospel side. On the credence table, there should be cruets containing water and wine for Mass, a lavabo dish and towel, a bell for the server to ring during Mass, and if communion is to be distributed to the faithful, a server's paten. The altar missal is placed on a missal stand, which is set square on the epistle side of the altar. The missal should be placed on the altar closed, with the pages facing towards the center of the altar. Prior to placing the missal on the altar, the priest should read through all the prayers proper to the Mass of the day. He should also set the ribbons to their appropriate places. The first ribbon should be placed at the introit of the Mass. If the introit comes from one of the commons, a second ribbon must be placed for the proper collect, secret, and post-communion. The last ribbon is placed at the appropriate preface. If in doubt about which Mass is to be said on a given day, check the liturgical ordo for the year. The altar is now dressed and ready for Mass. Prior to saying Mass, the priest should spend a little time in prayer to properly recollect himself. There are a number of prayers in the front of the altar missal which are provided for this purpose. The priest then goes to the sacristy to vest for Mass. The vestments should be laid out in the sacristy before Mass in the opposite order in which they are put on. First the chasuble, then the stole, then the maniple, the cincture, the alb, and the amice. When the priest enters the sacristy to begin vesting, he first washes his hands. While washing his hands, he says the prayer,
Da Domine, virtutum manibus meis, ad abstrugendum omnem maculam, ut sine pollutionem mentis et corporis variam tibi servire.
The priest then approaches the vesting table. He should be clothed in black shoes and cassock and remove his watch and any other jewelry. He may also remove his fascia. The priest then prepares the chalice for Mass. The cross at the base of the chalice should be facing forward. If the chalice does not have a cross, the priest should note some image or marking on the chalice as a reference point. This is so that the same side of the chalice will always be used when pouring in the water and wine and when drinking the precious blood and the ablutions. The purificator is laid over the top of the chalice, with the cross in the center and the ends draped over each side. The paten is laid on top of the purificator, with a large host placed in the center. The pall covers the paten. The chalice veil is then draped over the whole chalice so that the front part of the chalice is completely veiled. Usually there will be a decorative design on the front of the chalice veil, which should face forward. The corporal should have been folded and ironed previously in the following manner. The corporal is first folded into thirds, the bottom third folded up and the top third down. And then in thirds again, first the right side and then the left. The folded corporal is then placed inside the burse with the open ends facing out. The burse is laid on top of the chalice, with the closed fold towards the front and the open end towards the back. Each of the vestments has a prayer which is proper to it, and the priest should say this prayer as he puts on each of the vestments. He begins with the amice, taking it by the cords, and kissing the cross in the center. He then draws his right hand over his head, touches the amice to his head briefly, and begins the prayer.
Impone Domine capiti meo gallium salutis, ad expugniandos diabarucus incursus.
He wraps the amice around his neck so that the collar is completely covered. He crosses the right cord over the left, draws them around his back, and ties them in front. He tucks in the edges of the amice as necessary to cover the collar. He next takes the alb as he begins the prayer.
De alba me Domine et munde cor meum, ut in sanguine agni dealbatus gaudius perfuar sempiternis.
He first puts in the right sleeve, followed by the left. The server may assist the priest to make sure the alb falls evenly at his feet. It should cover the cassock completely and hang within a few inches of the floor. The server then presents the cincture, which the priest takes in both hands, and girds himself as he says the prayer.
Precinge me Domine cinguru puritatis, et extingue in lumbis meis, humorum libidinis, ut maniat in me virtus continentia castitatis.
He makes a knot in front and pulls it tight, leaving the ends hanging at the middle. He then checks to make sure the alb hangs evenly all the way around. The priest then takes the maniple, kisses the cross in the center, and puts it on his left arm as he says the prayer.
Mariare Domine, portare manipulum fletus et dolores, ut cum exultatione recipiam macedam laboris.
The maniple should be placed on the forearm towards the elbow, but not further. It is secured either with an elastic band or, more traditionally, with a maniple pin. The priest then takes the stole and kisses the cross in the center as he begins the prayer.
Redi mihi Domine solum immortalitatis quam perdidi in prevaricatione primi parentis, et quam vis indinius acceduat tuum sacrum mysterium meria tamen gaudium sempiternum.
He places it over his neck with the cross at the center. He then crosses the ends in front, right over left. He secures each end with the cincture, making 2 loops on either side, through which he then puts the ends of the cincture, allowing them to hang on either side. The priest then puts on the chasuble, assisted by the server. As he puts his head through, he says the prayer.
Domine quid existi, jugum meum suave est donus meum leve, fac ut istud portare sigvariam, quod consequar tuam gratiam. Amen.
Once the priest is fully vested, he picks up the chalice with his left hand and turns it so that the veiled side is facing away from him. He takes his biretta and covers his head, making sure the middle fin is towards his right. He then places his right hand on top of the burse to steady the chalice. The priest and server both bow their heads to the cross in the sacristy and then proceed to the altar. The server may give the priest holy water at the entrance to the chapel. It is also customary for the server to ring a bell as they enter to alert the people that Mass is beginning. They then proceed to the altar. The priest processes to the altar preceded by the server. If he should pass a tabernacle where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, both priest and server turn and genuflect to the Blessed Sacrament. Since the priest is carrying the chalice, he does not uncover his head while genuflecting. When the priest arrives at the foot of the altar where he is to say Mass, he uncovers and gives the biretta to the server who stands on his right. Both then reverence the altar. If the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in a tabernacle on or immediately behind the altar, the priest genuflects on the floor. If the Blessed Sacrament is not present, the priest makes a profound bow. The server, however, always genuflex. The priest then ascends the altar. The server assists by lifting the hem of his alb and cassock. When the priest arrives at the altar, he places the chalice towards the gospel side, turning it so that the veiled side faces towards him. He takes the burse with both hands, and then removes the corporal with his right hand and places it on the center of the altar in front of him. He then takes the burse with the right hand and sets the burse on the gospel side. The priest then unfolds the corporal with both hands. He arranges the corporal so that the near edge of the corporal is about an inch from the edge of the altar. He then takes the chalice with the left hand and sets it on the center of the corporal, but far enough back to leave him room to kiss the altar later. He then folds his hands before the breast, turns, and goes to the missal. At the missal, he opens the book with both hands and checks the ribbons to make sure they are set correctly for the Mass. He leaves the missal open to the page containing the introit, joins his hands, and goes to the center of the altar. He makes a low head bow to the altar cross, and then turns by his right to descend. As he turns, he steps a little to his left, so as not to turn his back completely to the altar. When he arrives at the foot of the altar, he again reverences the altar. If the Blessed Sacrament is present, he genuflects, although this genuflection will not be on the floor, but against the first step. If the Blessed Sacrament is not present, he bows profoundly. The priest and server then begin the prayers at the foot of the altar.